We've heard a lot since the election of Donald Trump about white nationalism. We've heard a lot about the quote unquote normalizing of white nationalism. There might be those who suggest that white nationalism and racism, which is its other name, are not that abnormal in our society to begin with. But this week we saw stunning comments from Representative Steve King, longtime Republican representative, member of Congress, Steve King, who said in defending the white nationalist candidacy of Geert Wilders abroad, said, quote, "We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies." Now, we need to talk about this kind of rhetoric, and we need to do it in a very serious way. Here to join us to talk about that now is Kelly J. Baker. Kelly has a PhD in American Religious History. She is the editor of Women in Higher Education, which is a feminist newsletter. And she's the author of the award-winning book, The Gospel According to the Klan, the KKK's Appeal to Protestant America, 1950 to 1930. So first of all, Kelly, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd say it's a pleasure if it weren't for the topic at hand, but let's start with Steve King. Were you shocked to see or hear him say those words about building our civilization on someone else's babies?
You know, I really wasn't shocked, partially because I feel like as a scholar of white nationalism and white supremacy, nothing right now shocks me. It all feels very historical. So to see someone use an argument about nervousness over what the nation's character is going to be and the need to have white babies, right? Though he tries to not quite be so explicit in the way he frames it. Instead, our civilization will somehow decline without this. That's fairly old school as far as white nationalism goes. I think what did surprise me about it was that he was so blatant and that he hasn't really backed down from this. There have been no apologies, right? There's been some justification on his part of what he's trying to say, and also a claim, of course, that he makes that it's not about race when we all know it actually is.
Right. I mean, the way they usually, and by they, you gathered from my intro, I think it's a broader swath of the population than just David Duke and the KKK, although I think they may be its heart. But I think there's a whole contingent of people who cloak their white nationalism in words about the greatness of Western civilization, or with Western being a euphemism for European and European being a euphemism for white. Am I being unfair there?
I don't think you're being unfair at all. There is a way in which Western civilization has long stood as code for white, European, often Protestant, depending on what kind of time period we are in. So that it's very coded language that he's using there, that it has a racial impact, that it's about whiteness, and that it's a tactic that a lot of other white nationalists in different historical times and places have actually used in a similar way to King's tweet, that they've kind of played up this nervousness over immigrants and concern over declining birth rates of white people as somehow this is dire for the nation. So he's very much in line with that. And so you're right on the money.
And what do you think about my thesis that this isn't an on or off switch, white nationalism, that there's kind of a spectrum to it, and that a lot of politicians have been well into that spectrum without getting as overt about it as Steve King did?
Oh, no, I think this is right, too. There was a lot of discussion in the lead up to the presidential election about dog whistles, right? Well, how are we talking about racism but not talking about racism? How are we playing to white nationalism in speeches and in media presentations and these sorts of things? And I think that there is a spectrum here. I think that there are a lot of people that buy into ideas about white nationalism without quite realizing that they're buying into ideas about white nationalism, that they don't understand that this is a larger ideology that people are falling for, or not falling for, but participating in a variety of different ways. So you mentioned David Duke, right? David Duke is sort of who we would point to. But Trump is able to sort of dog whistle in the campaign, right? And continues to on issues of race, especially around issues of immigration. And so go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to, I was listening and thinking, and when I say it's a gray area and you can be along the spectrum, let me pick a politician that I would not accuse in any way of being racist, but yet I believe, and I'm going to go back to the 2008 Democratic primary.
Okay.
I believe that, because I'm a little background. I come from white working class America. I come from Utica, New York, which was a blue collar town that lost most of its jobs with the loss of the Rust Belt and manufacturing. And when Geraldine Ferraro, as honorary co-chair of Hillary Clinton's campaign, said, and I'm going to paraphrase, about Barack Obama, it's not his turn.
Yeah.
I felt that was coded language that says that, to me, what that triggered as a former white working class American was, they don't want to wait in line. They want to take your dad's job down at the plant. They want to, and isn't that somewhere on this gradient too?
Oh, no, I think it definitely is. I mean, there's a conversation to be had here about the assumptions we make about whiteness and how we don't think about whiteness. And so for her to sort of suggest that Barack Obama is stepping out of place, again, falls in line with historical racist thinking about who is superior and who has to wait in their place until we tell them that they can move forward in our society, right? So that it's very much a piece of this. And you're right, like, this is a politician that I have no problem with, but again, it's that racialized kind of context that we have to pay attention to here. So that you kind of, once you start looking, I feel like you find it everywhere, even among politicians that we admire, that they're playing to sort of white voters in a different way that they're playing to people of color who are also voters, right? And that this is part of the kind of conversation that we have to have too.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And again, we're talking with Kelly J. Baker. And I also, by the way, I don't demonize ignorant people who fall for it necessarily. I mean, I think it gets to a point of overtness where, yeah, it's morally wrong. But I think people who are confused and frightened can be manipulated by this stuff. I feel in particular that the Republican Party has, everybody expressed justifiably outrage at Trump's comments about Muslims and about immigration. But I didn't feel there was a huge difference between what Trump did, as loathsome as it was, and what he said, and what was being said by other Republican politicians, including Ted Cruz, for example, talking about a religious test before we would let refugees into this country, or even Democratic politicians who said, as one of the Clintons did, that Muslims have to be vigilant, in their own communities, as if every Muslim knows who terror is. I mean, I think, again, there are gradients and there are degrees, but I feel as if Trump's offense was one of degree rather, and not the shocking new development in American politics. What do you think?
No, I mean, I think this is right. I don't think that Trump is shocking if we pay attention to the history of the Republican Party and how they've played towards racial politics and attempting to make certain groups into others that we can kind of work our own American identity against. So I think in that way, he's not out of line. I think there are people that try to suggest that, and I don't think it kind of holds water. But I also think it suggests to me more and more that white nationalism is a thing that's been with us for a while. And in the way that we talk about it, we kind of assume that it happened in the past, which is really unfortunate, because it means we've kind of quit paying attention to how it happens currently in the recent present. And so people can be shocked by Trump because they weren't paying attention to the way we're kind of doing the building blocks of white nationalism, maybe is one way to think about it, that sort of led us to him. And so I think that the sort of commonality of it is so important to pay attention to, that we have to just kind of think about, like, let's look and see where this does appear, right? In a comment by a politician that we like, maybe, or by the, apparatus of the Republican Party in this kind of fear-driven politics.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And for everything that I said about it being a gradient and all of this, I have to say that I had a kind of holy cow moment when I heard Steve King's quote, "You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies." I mean, I've never heard as overt a statement. No, I'm going to take that back. There was a lot of hostility towards African American reproduction in the 60s, but other than that, I haven't heard that overt a statement of hostility towards babies of who are not quote unquote yours, or
Right.
or as clear a demarcation of somebody else. Who's the somebody else in the country that's supposed to be the melting pot?
Right, right. And I mean, and it feels like I have this moments of disjuncture all the time now. My work primarily is on the 1920s Klan. I'm familiar with white nationalism and other periods, but I just keep having these moments where I'm like, wow, like this is the stuff that the Klansmen I studied would say out loud in the 20s. How is this happening on Twitter
Right.
in 2017, right? Like, it's this kind of weird space for me as a historian to be like, this is what folks were very overt about in the early 20th century. Like, how did we get around almost 100 years later, where this is like okay in public discussion, right? This might have been something that you would whisper, but to sort of put it out there and not back down, I think does signal something interesting. And by interesting, I mean not good,
Right.
right? Like about this.
Right, and by interesting we mean horrifying, and the fact that his party hasn't repudiated him or censured
Yeah.
him for this. Well, okay, you asked a fantastic question, which is how can it be nearly 100 years later, and this is still quote unquote okay to say? What do you have a theory? Do you have an answer?
Part of me wonders if folks are not emboldened by the way Trump handles himself, right? There was a lot in the kind of lead up to the election where they're like, well, he's a straight shooter who says what he thinks, right? And we can just let him say what he thinks. I'm not sure I'm okay with that, but there's a way in which I think that's emboldened other folks to feel like those opinions that they had to hide, right? That they maybe didn't want to say in polite company, or that they were nervous about somebody, calling them out on it and not being politically correct. I feel like some of those rules have been torn and tattered in how we handle public discourse. So I think that's part of it. And I think it also suggests to me that, again, that Americans are not very good at dealing with the history of race relations, and that part of the way we've navigated this is to not talk about race. And so people are having these subterranean conversations where they're like, yeah, we want more white babies, right, instead of immigrant babies. But now they feel like they can be out in the open because Trump is out in the open in a certain way about this stuff too.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because all of the people saying that are the children or grandchildren or descendants of immigrant babies. So, there's a whole, since you're a historian, Kelly, there's a whole school of historical chatter now, and I don't mean that in a derisive way, but about what the history of fascism can teach us
Right.
about this moment in history. In terms of your book on the Klan, are there lessons from that period of Ku Klux Klan history that can teach us something about the present, you think?
Yeah, I do think there are. I mean, one of the things that is apparent to me from that book is that the Klan was very popular in a moment. Like in a moment, they had millions of members. They had a message about white Protestant nationalism that really resonated. But that moment was fleeting. And people started working against them, right? There were groups that actively worked to sort of expose their racism, that actively worked against their propaganda about what making America great would look like. that there were people that were challenging them, that the press was challenging them, that the groups that they worked against were working together to go against them too. So I feel like there's a lesson in here about counter-organizing, and there's a lesson in here about the fact that this propaganda maybe doesn't last in the ways that we're nervous that it's going to last, that we can kind of keep working against it and keep offering better and more diverse stories about American history and American culture that can kind of challenge these views. So somebody told me that the book was optimistic, which I would have never imagined a book on the Klan being. But I think there is a little bit of optimism in there about like how just because these groups have power doesn't mean we have to follow along with their ideas about what our nation should be.
Absolutely, and very well said. So, okay, well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Kelly J. Baker, editor of Women in Higher Education and author of the book, The Gospel According to the Klan, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.